Kia ora mai tātou katoa, nā mai hara mai ki tēnei hui, nā mihi mahana ki a koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to this webinar. Really happy that so many people of you could make it. Today we have Growing Up in New Zealand presenting on the outcomes of the extreme weather survey. Just a bit of background, this project is part of the Extreme Weather Research Platform, and this platform was set up by MB and the Resilience Challenge after the extreme weather events last year, early 2023. And this specific project looks at understanding how extreme weather events impacted Rangatahi and whānau well-being. So without further ado, I'm gonna go to the presentation. We have today Professor Sarah Jane Payne presenting together with her colleagues Ben Fletcher and Denise Neumann. The floor is yours.
Kia ora, Ninka. Manawa mai te pūtanga o Matariki. Manawa mai te ariki o te rangi. Manawa mai te mātahi o te tau. Whanno, whanno, hara mai te toki. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Tēnā tātou katoa, ko Sarah Jane tōku ingoa, he uri ahau no te uruwera. Ko Ngāti Rongo te hapu, ko Tūhoi te iwi, I tipu aki au, I te wairoa, I te tairāwhiti. Tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora everyone, thank you Ninka for your introduction and to the Extreme Weather Platform for the opportunity to be part of this webinar today. My name's Sarah Jane. I am the Research Director of the Growing Up in New Zealand Longitudinal Study, and I'm joined here today by my colleagues Ben Fletcher and Denise Neumann, who are Research Fellows with this study. I'm going to share my slides now. So as was mentioned, the Growing Up in New Zealand study was really fortunate to receive some funding to be able to undertake a survey following the extreme weather events of 2023. One of the main reasons why we decided to put forward a proposal was that having the opportunity to contribute to the recovery and response planning really aligned with the vision that we have at Growing Up in New Zealand, that the work we do contributes to ensuring flourishing futures for all children and young people here in Aotearoa. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with longitudinal research or the Growing Up in New Zealand study, I think this statement of objectives, which was presented at the startup of Growing Up in New Zealand, really captures what our mission is as a study, but also how we felt it important that we try and contribute to the extreme weather platform and the recovery and response work that was happening in the affected communities. So it meant that we would really try and leverage the infrastructure and systems that we have in place at Growing Up in New Zealand, the relationships that we have with the cohort whānau that live in the affected areas, and through doing that create, we hope, develop a valuable data resource for policymakers and researchers to ensure that our futures here in New Zealand and our future planning with respect to extreme weather events really understand the experiences of rangatahi and whānau, of young people and their families, and that their voices are heard as part of that work. So when we were setting up our project, we thought about our own evidence that we've been collecting here at Growing Up in New Zealand, but also looked at the international evidence that gives us some insights into how extreme weather events impact on different elements of well-being. So what we could see is that particularly in the international evidence, that communities and we could define communities based on sort of region and location, but also communities who are marginalised in various ways, are particularly vulnerable to both the immediate but also long-term impacts of extreme weather events. And some of those communities are communities of young people themselves. More specifically, in terms of the local literature, we also understood that communities who experience socioeconomic disadvantage, but also Māori and Pacific young people in particular, were potentially more at risk of harmful impacts of extreme weather events, and that those axes of disadvantage may actually magnify or intensify some of those negative impacts when it comes to wellbeing. At Growing Up in New Zealand, the study's been collecting information about psychological and mental health for a very long time, both of the mothers and primary caregivers of the young people in our cohort, and more recently from the young people themselves. So we felt that if we were able to survey our cohort, that then we'd also contribute not only sort of a cross-sectional or point in time data set that would help us understand what some of the wellbeing impacts are right now, but offer opportunities for some of the longitudinal insights to be created using the existing data, but also any future data that we're able to collect at Growing Up in New Zealand. And as I said, we really wanted to leverage our existing systems, infrastructure and relationships so that we could stand this project up as quickly as possible, recognising that capturing the data as close in time to those extreme weather events would be really important for the validity of the work that we were doing, but also to ensure that we were sharing that data back out to people working in the recovery and response areas as quickly as possible. So just a couple of slides that will help you understand a little bit more about our cohort and who we surveyed and our methods in terms of questionnaire development. So Growing Up in New Zealand is a very large and diverse cohort of young people and their mothers. So you can see those numbers within our cohort at the top of this illustration. For this particular project, we understood that MB and government were particularly interested in understanding the impacts of the extreme weather events in certain regions in the North Island. So within our cohort, we looked at the numbers of participating young people and families who were living in Te Tai Tokerau, Northland, Te Tai Rāwhiti, East Coast and Gisborne, and Te Mataua Maui in Hawke's Bay. We also knew that the floods, the Auckland Anniversary Weekend Flooding, were particularly devastating here in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. So we also included a selection of families living here in Auckland. So you can see then that the number of young people and their mothers who are eligible for the extreme weather survey are essentially a subgroup of our cohort. And that final set of numbers tells you the number of respondents we had to our survey. We had a month-long data collection period. So we opened our questionnaire in the beginning of August and wrapped up in early September. In the study, we designed questionnaires specifically to answer and address the wellbeing impacts of these extreme weather events. We leveraged some of the questionnaire items and tools that we have used in the past as part of our usual data collection waves at Growing Up in New Zealand, but we also engaged with and consulted in particular the chief science advisors who were supportive and sponsored this study to try and understand what what are the questions, what is the information that is required in those areas for those communities, for regional councils, for example, but also from a central government perspective. So we designed 2 questionnaires. We had one specifically for the young people to complete, which was a brief questionnaire, a 15-minute questionnaire, and then another questionnaire which the mother completed, answering some questions at sort of a household level or by proxy, and then some other questions, a small number of questions about their own experience of those extreme weather events. We also, when we were designing our study and the questionnaires, we sort of recognised that whilst our participants would be living in areas we understood to have been impacted by the Auckland Anniversary Weekend floods and Cyclone Gabrielle, not everyone who we sampled might have considered themselves to be affected or actually were affected. And so we included a questionnaire to try and tease that experience out, and as we go through the presentation, you might see some reference to groups who were affected, who said yes they were affected, and groups who said no, they weren't affected themselves, but they knew someone who was affected, or they were living in an area that was affected. And so now I'm going to hand over to Denise, who's going to take you through the first set of findings from our extreme weather survey. Kia ora, Denise.
Tēnā koe, Jane. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Denise Nama tōku ingoa. And yeah, so Jane has mentioned, I will present you with the first set of key findings for the 4 first key areas that we looked at as part of the extreme weather event survey. But firstly, talking you through some key sociodemographic characteristics of the young people in our sample. So here you can see the map with the regions that we surveyed. And as part of our Growing Up New Zealand cohort, we had the majority of our sample being in the Auckland regions, so about a bit over 80%, but we also had participants from Hawke's Bay, Northland and Gisborne. Here you can see key sociodemographic distributions, and I won't go into too much detail, but to highlight and show that we had a good representation of key sociodemographic groups. So we see a good distribution of ethnicity, particularly we had a relatively high proportion of Maori and Pacific young people, which was our target as well due to the impacts that might disproportionately affect young people. We also had a diversity with respect to gender identity and a good representation of deprivation as per the NZ depth index across all the 5 quintiles. Going back to what Sarah Jane had outlined, we had this kind of initial question in our survey to get a bit of a impression of how the young people and their caregivers of our cohort see themselves affected by the extreme weather events. So we kept it relatively open to their interpretation what affected means. So it could have been physical or damages to their properties or houses, but of course could also have been any impacts on their mental health and well-being. And as you can see, the distribution is relatively similar for both young people and caregivers. So about half of the cohort in each group said they were not affected. And then we have 24% of young people and 27% of primary caregivers who indicated they were affected in one way or another by the extreme weather events. And then we also had thought it would be useful to have a third category, because even though some might not have been directly affected or impacted, it still makes a difference whether you know someone who was affected or if you were living in an area that was affected. And so we see also a relatively similar distribution across the two groups. And our subsequent reporting, where possible and where numbers were allowing, we reported our key findings by these 3 groups, and also where suitable in terms of numbers and cell sizes, we also try to report some of these findings we're presenting to you today by the different regions. Yeah, so the first kind of bigger block of questions relating to how well prepared the cohort felt in preparation or beforehand, before these extreme weather events occurred. And that also included the first set of questions where we asked how well informed they actually felt about these events and how to prepare for them. And as you can see here, over half of primary caregivers indicated they actually did not see any information or advice on how to prepare for these extreme weather events. And we then also followed up in a bit more detail and asking what kind of information participants would have liked to see and on how to prepare. And here you can see the 5 key areas of information that Whānau would have liked to receive, and that was planning for evacuation, preparing a grab bag, clearing drains, storing or stocking up on water, or purchasing other supplies. So this, what I was just presenting was around how informed the participants felt, and then we also asked specifically what actual preparations Whānau had made. And here in this graph, so the way we structured the question was asking what kind of preparations did you make, and we gave them a list of different options where they could indicate yes, we have prepared or not. So here you can see the frequency distribution of all these different types of preparations, and you can see the number of participants who prepared. And within each of these types of preparations, as presented as the bars, you can see how many had said yes, they had prepared for it, as indicated in green. And so what we could see that, most frequently preparations were made in terms of storing or stocking up on water and food. So that was quite a high number. And then followed by charging electronics or phones, and also purchasing other supplies. And also to highlight here, this is the Auckland region specifically, but obviously because of the high number of Whānau from Auckland, this is quite representative how it looked for the overall sample. And when we then looked at this information a bit further by the different regions, Te Tai Tokerau, Northland, and Te Tai Rāwhiti, East Coast, and Gisborne, and it also includes Hawke's Bay. We see it's a relatively similar distribution with some smaller differences. For example, in the Northland area, there was more people were actually storing up on food and other supplies, and in the Tai Rāwhiti area, a lot of people also prepared for a grab bag. Obviously, we need to keep in mind these numbers were relatively small, but we can see some smaller regional differences. In addition to asking a set of standardized questions and some specifically developed questions to really capture these impacts of the extreme weather, we also wanted to hear the voice of the young people themselves a bit further. So we included a couple of open-ended questions at the end. So one of these questions was, what do you think the Prime Minister should do to support young people who might experience a natural disaster? And our team then looked at all of the statements that young people made and looked through if we could identify some common themes without doing a formal analysis. But what stood out to us, we included a couple of these quotes into this presentation to give you an impression of the young people's voices. And so kind of relating to this overall theme of preparedness, we saw, gave you a few examples. So one young person from the Tai Tokerau said, if I feel we should learn about preparing for emergencies and first aid and evacuation plan, kind of reflecting that quite a high number of participants didn't really feel well prepared. A young person from South Auckland said, trust your parents and always try to stay up to date. There's always help if you ask. So this was another theme that we identified throughout, that young people overall felt quite well supported by their whānau and communities. And another young person from South Auckland said, give us younger generation the opportunity to participate and support those in need, find ways that we can, that we as young people can help our community. So that was also a very strong theme, that young people, despite their own adverse experiences, were really keen to help others and their own communities. The second bigger theme we looked at was around housing. Within our cohort, 4% of whānau reported their family actually had to evacuate the home as a result of the extreme weather. And of these whānau, 44% weren't able to live in their homes for more than 1 week. And also about a little bit less than a quarter said that their housing costs had also increased generally as part of the extreme weather events. We also asked the young people themselves in relation to their housing situation, and 27% indicated their house was severely or moderately damaged. About half said their neighborhood was damaged, and 11% had indicated some of their belongings were damaged. And this kind of reflects those earlier distributions around young people saying they were affected themselves or were living in an area that was affected. Again, to better elevate the young people's voices, what the young person from Hawke's Bay said, make a charity to raise money to repair special or significant places that have been damaged. So that was another theme that we saw throughout, young people really saying, you know, we need to try to support whānau and raise money for those things that were being damaged. And another young person from East Auckland said, I think the government should have also hosted a fun day for families, especially children who went through such trauma. This could include games, food, theme park rides, etc. And this could hopefully get the kids out of the house, their minds off, rather than just watching it all unfold in front of them. So really also highlighting it was probably a quite prolonged period with negative news and adverse experiences. So young people would have liked also an opportunity to maybe have a bit of a distraction and some positive experiences through this time. Another key area we looked at was in terms of how were quite key infrastructure and services impacted by the extreme weather. So we saw that quite a lot of whānau experienced disruptions to mainly affected were power, internet, mobile phone coverage, and water. And many of these services were disrupted for 3 or more days. If we look at it like this for the overall cohort, it looks like it's relatively in the medium range. But if we break this information further down by the different regions, we can see Tamaki Makaurau was a little bit less severely impacted. But if we look at the Tai Tokiro Northland, we see that quite a large proportion of people were affected or impacted or experienced disruptions to these key services. And these are all were disrupted for longer than 3 days. And even worse, Te Tairaki, East Coast and Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, where almost everyone in the cohort experienced these disruptions, and most of them were ongoing over several days. And so you see some quite concerning numbers, especially also things like water and other essential services being impacted. So that again highlights sometimes those regional there were also some stronger regional differences. And the other part of kind of these service and infrastructure experiences we wanted to explore was with respect to unmet needs. So the way we structured this was we asked the primary caregivers what areas would they have needed some support with, and we gave them a whole list of things that could indicate they would have needed support with. And then we also had another separate question that asked, and how, for which of these services did you actually receive support, which was exactly the same list of things. And then we could map the ones that had said they needed support against what support they actually received. And when we grouped this into kind of some overall themes, we saw that 34% who would have needed support with property, transport or belongings did not receive it. 23% who would have required financial assistance did not receive it. 21% would have needed support with food, water, clothes, and other essentials did not receive it. And also 17% who would have required medical or mental health care were not getting their needs met in this area. Yeah, and to finish this kind of overall key areas, again, highlighting what our young people have said. So we could see some also, again, those regional differences. A young person from Northland saying, make sure the communications stay working, which was strong impact in that area. A young person from South Auckland said more support services to help young people deal with the trauma of being affected by natural disasters, also provide the basic needs for free, like accommodation, food, clothing, and appropriate footwear, bedding, etc. So that clearly highlights, and what we could see other young people saying, that young people are well aware of their basic needs and that they have not been met, and also voicing that this should actually be something that they should be getting support with for free. And this is, a basic standard need and rights they should be getting. And another young person from South Auckland said to create a fund for young people, to encourage them to create and design what they need during a natural disaster. Just like a flood relief fund, there should be one for the youth also. And that's one of the really emerging themes we saw. Young people are well aware that their experiences are different and might be different looking to those of adults, and that they also feel like their voices should be heard, and that they actually can provide the best solutions themselves if they get the opportunity to contribute and have a space where they can share their voices. Yeah, and on that note, I'm handing it over to my colleague, Ben.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Denise. I'm just going to run through the last few key findings, looking at young people's schooling, the impact on their everyday life and activities, mental health and physical health outcomes. So starting with schooling, the two extreme weather events that occurred in January and February of 2023 coincided with the start of the school year, and many of the young people in the Growing Up in New Zealand cohort would have been transitioning to Year 9 at this time, with more than half, at approximately 62%, starting a new school at the beginning of 2023. Now, due to the floods and the cyclone, over 2/3, so approximately 67% of young people reported that they were delayed from starting their school. A majority of young people, approximately 82% of young people, had time off from school because of the extreme weather's events. And of the young people who had time off from school, most had less than 1 week off school, but approximately 4% had less than 1 day off school, 42% had between 1 and 3 days off school, almost 30% had 4 to 5 days off school, and almost 20% of the cohort reported that they had more than 1 week off school due to the extreme weather events. Thankfully, though, most of the young people did not have to change schools or move school buildings due to damage or any influence from the extreme weather events. When we look at schooling by region, more young people in Auckland reported that they had a delay from starting their school, And this corresponded with the Auckland Anniversary Weekend Flooding, during which all of the schools in Auckland were closed. A majority of young people in Auckland and Northland had time off school, with most of these students reporting that they needed less than 1 week off school. But in contrast, almost all of the participants in the Hawke's Bay and Gisborne region reported having time off school, and almost 70% of these young people reported that they had more than 1 week off school. Again, though, despite delays and time off school, thankfully most of the students did not need to move schools or move school buildings because of the extreme weather events, regardless of the region that they lived in. For the two extreme weather events that are, when we were looking at young people's voices, we wanted to incorporate as much information as we could, and a lot of what we found in the more objective measures were represented by the young people's voices as well, and they often talked about wanting to have practical plans in place in terms of having a safe place to go, or having areas of transport that they could, or transport plans that they could have and rely on if there was an extreme weather event or other disasters that may have happened. So an example of one of these young people saying providing support within schools and making sure that teachers and adults check up on young people to ensure that they're doing okay, as well as having a plan in terms of having transport plans and safe spaces, was a common theme throughout a lot of the information that was received by young people. We also asked young people how much their everyday activities were interrupted or stopped because of the floods or cyclone. As you can see by this graph here, students could report they were not affected at all, or their activities were not interrupted or stopped during term 1 because of the extreme weather events, represented by the dark blue at the bottom of the graph. If activities were interrupted a little, it's represented by the light blue, and if activities were interrupted a lot, it's shown by the green at the top of the graph. Mainly school activities such as arts, music and kapahaka, and social activities including sports, going to the mall, marae or church, and seeing friends were interrupted by the flooding or cyclone. And not as many young people experienced interruptions with their online gaming or communications. For regional data, these disruptions on everyday life were very similar for the Auckland region and the total cohort. So the Auckland regional chart is not shown here, but again, the pattern of results was similar for Northland. However, young people reported more disruptions on everyday life activities, such as seeing friends and families, while participants in the East Coast, Hawke's Bay and Gisborne regions reported greater disruptions for almost all of their everyday life categories, with the most noticeable difference being for young people reporting a lot of disruptions to online gaming and communication. When we're looking at young people's mental health outcomes, we can see that more of the young people who reported that they were not affected by the extreme weather events, which is shown by the green distribution at the back of this graph, reported lower levels of depression symptoms, so lower severity of depression symptoms, and those who were more affected or reported that they were affected by the extreme weather events, you can see that there are more people who reported that they had higher levels of depression symptoms, shown by the greater proportion of the dark blue moving towards the higher scores on the depression scale. However, it's important to note that this is not a causal relationship here, where an additional research is required to determine if those who experienced poor mental health symptoms were more likely to report feeling affected by the extreme weather events, or if experiencing the extreme weather events themselves resulted in poorer mental health outcomes. And again, we saw similar results and similar patterns for anxiety symptoms, where there was almost a stepwise pattern of young people who reported being affected by extreme weather events showed greater anxiety symptoms compared to those who were not affected, and those who knew someone who was affected tended to be somewhere in between in how they felt in terms of their anxiety symptoms. And we see similar patterns again with young people's self-reported sleep quality. So young people who were affected by the extreme weather events reported poorer sleep compared to those who are not affected, which again is shown by the higher proportion of people who are higher up on that scale towards the right-hand side of that graph. When we're talking about physical injuries and physical health, 97% of young people reported that they were not physically injured, and 93% of mothers and primary caregivers reported that they were not physically injured as well. And despite over 90% of young people and mothers reporting that they were not physically injured during the extreme weather events, approximately 30% of mothers and primary caregivers reported that someone in the family felt traumatized by the extreme weather events. And when this data was collected, about 25% reported that they were okay at the time, and almost 5% reported still feeling traumatized from the events, approximately 6 months after the extreme weather events. And when, again, asking young people for their voice about what advice they would give to other young people who might experience flood or cyclone in the future, it was emphasised that it's not your fault. You're allowed to be sad, talk to friends and adults if you can, because it can be hard. And talking to a trusted person or an adult and getting help from a counsellor and community support, reaching out to somebody and not keeping it inside, because it can make you feel even more stressed. And this was emphasised and shown by the results that we found, where people who were affected did seem to have higher levels of anxiety and reported poorer mental health outcomes. So emphasising that there is a need for having services or support structures or a trusted adult or person in their life may make a significant difference in how they respond to these extreme weather events. I'll now pass back to Sarah Jane to do some closing remarks.
Kia ora, Ben. Thank you. So as I mentioned earlier in our presentation, we really wanted to be able to contribute something back to the people and communities involved in recovery and response planning. All of the information that we've taken you through today is available as a full report on our website, and so you can see there are a bunch of links here which we really invite you to visit and engage with. We knew that having some regionally focused information was also going to be really important, because as you've seen through Ben and Denise's presentations, if we just look at all of our participants together, we do see some interesting patterns, but actually there's also some very important regional differences that need to be understood, and for those communities to be able to implement supports and response plans that reflect the needs of young people living in their communities. So those regional snapshots are also available from our study. As with all of the data that's collected and growing up in New Zealand, the data set that we've created off the back of the extreme weather survey is available for researchers. So we have an established process for applying and accessing growing up in New Zealand data, including this extreme weather survey data set via our website. So we hope that what we've produced and shown you here today is useful and meaningful in itself, but we also know that there will be other really important questions that come from people and communities outside the Growing Up in New Zealand team. So we really hope that you'll make use of the data to help us better understand some of the more nuanced and important patternings related to extreme weather events, and well-being for young people here in Aotearoa. And there's other information about our Growing Up in New Zealand data sets there too. Just briefly, so undertaking the survey and providing this information and the data was really an important outcome or objective for our survey, but we also wanted to ensure that what we did was useful and meaningful for young people themselves. So we've got a couple of examples of what that looks like. So for the people in our cohort, as a show of gratitude for the time and their willingness to take part in a survey quite close to having experienced those extreme weather events, we wanted to give them something back. And so we created this guide. It's called the Uncivil Defence Guide, that we hope has a look and feel and a tone and a language that is engaging for young people and really focuses on providing them with suggestions to stay well and feel well after extreme weather events. But it's not just for our cohort. A PDF is available via the link on screen for any young people, any whānau, any communities who might want something to share with young people that they know. And we also partnered with Toi Matarua, which is a Rangatahi-led research group based in Hawke's Bay. And through our partnership, Toi Matarua created and launched a short film which really highlights, I think, what we've seen in some of the quotes from our cohort around the leadership that Rangatahi show during very stressful situations. They are still willing to stand up and look after their friends, to look after their whānau and to look after their communities. And so the Mokoboy film really showcases that Rangatahi leadership, and you know, we invite you to visit their website and to really enjoy the short film that they've created for themselves and their communities. So I can see, Ninka, you're on screen here, so I wonder if you're hoping we'll go to Q&A very shortly, but you can see the sort of summary of the information that we've presented to you today. If I was to sort of have one wrap-up summary statement, it would be really to encourage everyone to remember young people, not just as a community who are vulnerable to these types of events, but a community whose insights and understanding of their reality can and should be used to inform recovery and response planning. They know what's going on around them. They know what works for them and their friends and their whānau, and they know what is needed. So I really do invite everyone who's involved in this work and any other similar work to really think about those voices of young people and to find ways to really bring them together as an important part of the community who's strengthening our response system here in Aotearoa. So final slide is to thank everyone, particularly the Growing Up in New Zealand cohort and whānau who participated. Our team, there's more than 3 people who sit in the background at Growing Up in New Zealand, who went out into the regions to support the whānau to complete their questionnaires, and obviously to MB and to their platform for the funding and support they provided so that we could do this really important kaupapa focus work. Kia ora.
Thank you so much, Sarah, Denise and Ben. I think for me, it's so very valuable to hear about the young people's voices. We have a few questions in the chat, and so let's go through them. There was one question at the beginning. Let me see if I can find it. Scrolling through all the questions. Yeah, is this the first example where Growing Up in New Zealand is exploring the climate change dimension in a study?
So I believe it is, and it was really interesting to have the opportunity to think not only about extreme weather events, but other sort of climate related well-being issues. So, for example, climate anxiety, which we understand from the literature is really an emerging issue of concern for young people internationally. So yes, I believe it is the first time we've asked about sort of climate. We have asked some similar questions in previous data collections around sort of more around the ability of families home to stay warm or to keep cool, which is really important for climate, but to ask people about their experience of weather events and climate is sort of a new area for us.
Thank you. Another question, will the presentation be made available? I can answer that. Yes, we will make it available. It will be recorded and it will be shared after the session. Is there a report release date? Well, Sarah covered that already in one of her last slides. There is, go to their website. The link is also in the chat. There's heaps of background information and reports available there. Has there been appetite from local or national government to meaningfully include young people's voices in emergency planning or responses? Are you aware of any of those?
I'm sorry, I'm not able to comment on that. I know when we met with the chief science advisors about this project, and when we presented to the regional science managers meeting, I think there was certainly interest. I can say there's been a lot of interest in the work and therefore the space that can be created for young people, but I can't comment on what's currently being done or the appetite, as they say, around it.
Those were all the questions, actually. Well, if anybody has another question, please do pop it in the chat. We're very happy to answer those. But yeah, for now, these are it. Are there any final remarks you, Denise or Ben, like to make? Good. Well, thank you so much for sharing this and for sharing the outcomes. I would highly recommend everybody to go to the website and read more about this really interesting research and these results. And with that, I would say kua mutu tatato hui tēnā koutou katoa ka kite.
Hilda, thank you.
Kia ora.